Ladies and gentlemen, the phone call came at 3 in the morning. A senior official at the Pentagon, coffee already cold on his desk, stared at the encrypted message flashing across his screen. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the secure line to wake his superior. What he had just read would change everything. Canada, the nation that shared the longest undefended border with the United States, the country that had stood shoulder to shoulder with America through 2 world wars, Korea, Afghanistan, and countless crises, had just signed a deal with China. Not just any deal. A $7 billion mega agreement that Pentagon analysts were already calling the most significant geopolitical shift in North American relations since the Cold War. By sunrise, the news would break. By noon, the world would be asking the same question that was racing through this officer's mind as he dialed, had America's closest ally just chosen Beijing over Washington? The story of how we arrived at this moment begins not in Ottawa or Beijing, but in the ruins of what globalization promised and failed to deliver. For decades, Canada had played the role of America's loyal northern neighbor, a relationship so close that it became almost invisible. The two nations shared not just a border, but intelligence networks, defense systems, trade routes worth hundreds of billions annually, and a cultural understanding that made their alliance seem eternal. Canadian troops had died alongside Americans in distant wars. Canadian resources had fueled American industries. Canadian diplomats had backed American positions in international forums, even when it cost them dearly. This was more than alliance. This was family, or so everyone thought. But beneath the surface of this seemingly unbreakable bond, something had been shifting for years, invisible to most observers, but growing more urgent with each passing month. Canada, despite its vast landmass and abundant resources, had been feeling increasingly squeezed. The American administration, under successive presidents from both parties, had treated Canada less like a partner and more like a subordinate. Trade disputes had become routine, with American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum justified under national security pretenses that insulted Canadian leaders and businesses alike. Water rights, energy exports, and Arctic sovereignty had all become points of friction. Rhetoric of America first had resonated with voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania, but it had landed like a slap across the face in Toronto and Vancouver. Every time an American politician promised to protect American jobs by getting tough on trade, Canadian workers understood exactly what that meant. They were the acceptable casualties in someone else's political campaign. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China had been watching and waiting with the patience of a civilization that measures time in dynasties rather than election cycles. Chinese diplomats and trade representatives had been quietly building relationships in Ottawa for over a decade, attending conferences, funding cultural exchanges, investing in Canadian real estate and businesses, and most importantly, listening. They listened when Canadian business leaders complained about American unpredictability. They listened when Canadian politicians expressed frustration about being taken for granted. They listened when Canadian resource companies talked about needing new markets for their lumber, their minerals, their energy. And while they listened, they planned. The deal that emerged from these years of careful cultivation is staggering in its scope and ambition. $7 billion is just the headline number, the figure designed to capture attention in news bulletins and social media posts. But the real story lies in what that money represents and what it will build. At its core, this agreement commits China to purchasing a massive quantities of Canadian natural resources over the next 15 years, including liquefied natural gas, rare earth minerals crucial for technology manufacturing, uranium for nuclear power, and timber for construction. In exchange, Chinese state-owned enterprises will invest in Canadian infrastructure, building ports on the Pacific coast specifically designed to ship Canadian goods to Asian markets, upgrading rail lines to transport resources from the interior to these new shipping hubs, and constructing processing facilities that will create thousands of jobs in provinces that have watched their traditional industries decline for decades. But the deal goes far beyond simple resource extraction and trade. Buried in the hundreds of pages of agreements are provisions that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. Chinese technology companies will be granted access to help build out Canada's 5G telecommunications network in regions where American companies have been blocked or priced out. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers will establish production facilities in Ontario and Quebec, bringing with them the battery technology and supply chains that could make Canada a major player in the automotive revolution away from fossil fuels. Chinese financial institutions will be allowed to expand their operations in Canadian cities, offering loans and investment services that compete directly with American banks that have dominated the Canadian market for generations. And perhaps most controversially, the agreement includes security provisions that allow for increased Chinese investment in Canadian ports and transportation infrastructure, raising immediate red flags among American intelligence officials who see potential vulnerabilities in the North American defense perimeter. The announcement, when it finally came, was carefully choreographed for maximum impact. The Canadian Prime Minister stood at a podium in Ottawa, flanked by provincial premiers and business leaders, their faces a mixture of determination and defiance. The speech was masterful in its framing, emphasizing Canadian sovereignty, economic opportunity, and the need to diversify in an uncertain world. There was no mention of betrayal, no acknowledgement that this represented a fundamental realignment away from the United States. Instead, the language was all about partnership, growth, and securing Canada's future for the next generation. The Chinese ambassador to Canada stood in the audience, his expression neutral, but his presence speaking volumes. This was not a deal done in the shadows. This was a statement delivered in daylight for the whole world to see. The American response was swift and visceral. Within hours, cable news networks were running segments with titles like Northern Betrayal and The Ally We Lost. Former military officials appeared on screen, their faces grave, explaining the strategic implications of having Chinese economic influence so deeply embedded in a country that shares critical defense infrastructure with the United States. Politicians from both parties issued statements ranging from disappointment to outrage. The president's national security team convened emergency meetings to assess the damage and formulate a response. On social media, the reaction was even more intense, with Americans expressing shock that their neighbor, their friend, their ally of over 2 centuries could make such a move without consultation, without warning, without apparent concern for how it would impact the relationship that had defined both nations for so long. But in Canada, the reaction told a different story. Yes, there were critics who warned of becoming too dependent on an authoritarian regime, who questioned the wisdom of trading one dominant partner for another, who worried about the long-term implications of allowing Chinese state-owned enterprises such significant access to Canadian infrastructure. Yet there was also something else, something that American observers seemed to miss entirely in their initial shock and anger. There was relief. There was pride. There was a sense that finally, after years of being taken for granted, Canada was asserting itself on the global stage. Canadian social media lit up with comments supporting the deal, not necessarily because people loved China, but because they were tired of feeling like a junior partner in a relationship where their needs and concerns were consistently dismissed. One viral post captured the mood perfectly. Maybe if they had treated us like allies instead of a resource colony with good manners, we wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. To understand why this deal represents such a seismic shift, you need to understand the intricate web of interdependencies that have bound the North American economy together for generations. Every day, billions of dollars worth of goods cross the Canadian-American border. American auto plants depend on Canadian parts. Canadian grocery stores stock American produce. Energy grids are integrated across the border, with electricity flowing north and south based on demand and capacity. The defense relationship is even more integrated with NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command, representing one of the most successful military partnerships in history. The two nations share intelligence so sensitive that it forms the backbone of the Five Eyes network that also includes the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. This isn't just alliance, this is integration at a level that makes the idea of separation almost inconceivable. Or at least it was. The China deal threatens all of this because it introduces a third party into what has always been essentially a bilateral relationship. American officials immediately began asking questions that revealed the depth of their concern. If Chinese companies are involved in Canadian telecommunications, how secure is the intelligence sharing that flows across those networks? If Chinese state-owned enterprises control Canadian port facilities, what happens during a crisis in the Pacific where American and Chinese interests collide? If Canadian rare earth minerals, essential for everything from smartphones to missile systems, are contractually committed to China, what happens to American supply chains that have always assumed Canadian resources would be available when needed? These aren't hypothetical concerns. These are the practical, immediate questions that keep defense planners awake at night. China, for its part, has been celebrating the deal as vindication of its Belt and Road strategy and proof that even America's closest allies recognize the inevitable shift in global power. Chinese state media has run extensive coverage emphasizing the mutual benefits and portraying China as a respectful partner that treats Canada as an equal, a subtle but pointed contrast to the relationship Canada has had with its southern neighbor. Chinese officials have been careful not to gloat publicly, understanding that appearing to drive a wedge between the United States and Canada would only backfire. But in private briefings and diplomatic channels, the message is clear. The era of unchallenged American dominance in its own hemisphere is over. The economic implications ripple outward in ways that most people won't immediately recognize, but will definitely feel. American companies that relied on Canadian resources now face uncertainty about long-term availability and pricing. The integrated supply chains that made North American manufacturing competitive against Asian and European rivals suddenly look vulnerable. Canadian businesses that exported to the United States now have an attractive alternative market that doesn't come with the political volatility that has characterized American trade policy in recent years. The shift isn't immediate, and it isn't total, but it's real, and it's structural. This isn't a trade dispute that can be resolved with a new agreement or a change in administration. This is a fundamental reorientation of economic gravity. But perhaps the most profound impact is psychological and strategic. For over a century, American foreign policy has operated on the assumption that the Western Hemisphere, and particularly North America, was secure. The United States could project power globally because it didn't have to worry about threats or competition in its own backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, updated and modernized over the decades, essentially declared that the Americas were America's sphere of influence. And while that influence was sometimes resented, it was never seriously challenged by a peer competitor. China's successful penetration of the Canadian market represents the first real breach in that hemisphere security in modern history. It's one thing for China to build ports in Africa or invest in South American infrastructure. It's quite another for China to establish deep economic and potentially strategic presence in a country that shares the longest land border with the United States. Military analysts are already gaming out scenarios that would have seemed absurd just months ago. What happens if tensions in the Taiwan Strait escalate and the United States asks Canada to join in sanctions or military preparations, but Canada's economic dependence on China makes such support impossible or politically unfeasible? What happens if Chinese ships, ostensibly engaged in legitimate trade with Canada, begin regular transit through Arctic waters that both Canada and the United States consider strategically vital? What happens if Canadian politicians, facing pressure from business interests tied to Chinese investment, begin to distance themselves from American positions in international forums, breaking the united front that has characterized Western diplomacy for decades? The defenders of the deal, and there are many, present a completely different narrative that's equally compelling. They argue that Canada hasn't betrayed anyone, but has simply recognized economic reality and acted in its own national interest, which is exactly what every sovereign nation should do. They point out that the United States has itself maintained massive trade relationships with China for decades, that American companies have eagerly invested in Chinese markets and manufacturing, and that it's hypocritical to criticize Canada for pursuing opportunities that American businesses have been exploiting for years. They note that the United States has repeatedly demonstrated that it will prioritize its own interests over its allies when politically convenient, imposing tariffs, blocking exports, and making unilateral decisions that impact Canadian workers and communities without consultation or compensation. They argue that diversification isn't betrayal, it's prudence, and that having all your economic eggs in one basket, no matter how friendly that basket has historically been, is simply bad strategy in an unpredictable world. Furthermore, Canadian supporters of the deal emphasize that this isn't about choosing China over America, but about having options and leverage. For too long, they argue, Canada has been a price taker in its relationship with the United States, accepting whatever terms were offered because there was no alternative. Now, with a major Chinese commitment, Canada can negotiate with the United States from a position of strength rather than dependency. If American leaders want to maintain their preferred level of access to Canadian resources and markets, they'll need to offer terms that actually reflect a partnership of equals, rather than assuming Canadian cooperation is automatic and unconditional. This perspective sees the China deal not as the end of the Canada-US relationship, but as a necessary corrective that might actually make that relationship healthier in the long run by forcing both sides to treat each other with the respect and consideration that true allies deserve. The environmental dimension adds another layer of complexity that divides opinion in Canada and internationally. China has committed to purchasing Canadian natural gas as part of its transition away from coal, which sounds positive for global carbon emissions. Chinese investment in Canadian electric vehicle manufacturing could accelerate the transition away from fossil fuel vehicles. But critics point out that increased extraction of Canadian resources to feed Chinese manufacturing and construction could actually increase overall carbon emissions, and that Chinese environmental standards for the projects they'll be building in Canada may not match Canadian expectations. There's also the uncomfortable reality that some of the rare earth minerals China wants from Canada will be used in renewable energy technologies. But the mining processes required to extract them can be environmentally devastating. The deal forces Canadians to confront difficult questions about whether economic development and climate commitments can actually coexist, or whether they're accepting Chinese investment because it comes with fewer environmental strings attached than equivalent American or European funding would demand. The human stories emerging from communities affected by the deal reveal how abstract geopolitics becomes concrete reality in people's lives. In British Columbia, a port town that has struggled since the lumber industry declined, is preparing for an economic renaissance as Chinese investment promises to rebuild the harbor and create hundreds of jobs. Workers who had resigned themselves to moving away from employment are suddenly making plans to stay, to raise their families in the communities where they grew up. But they're also aware that their newfound prosperity is tied to a country thousands of miles away with very different values and systems, and that dependence makes some of them uncomfortable even as they cash their paychecks. In Ontario, auto workers are being told that new Chinese electric vehicle plants could save their industry, but they're also being asked to learn new skills and adapt to different corporate cultures that don't always align with the union traditions and worker protections they've fought for over generations. These aren't simple stories of winners and losers. They're complicated narratives about survival, adaptation, and the price of economic security in a rapidly changing world. The international reaction has been equally divided and revealing. European allies have watched with a mixture of concern and a certain grim recognition. They too have experienced the challenges of managing relationships with both the United States and China, of trying to maintain values-based foreign policy while acknowledging economic realities. Some European leaders have quietly reached out to Canadian counterparts, not to criticize, but to compare notes and strategies. Australia, which has its own complex and often painful experience trying to balance its security alliance with the United States against its economic dependence on China, has been particularly attentive. The Canada-China deal serves as either a cautionary tale or a potential roadmap depending on your perspective. Smaller nations around the world are watching to see if Canada can actually pull off this balancing act, if it's possible to take Chinese investment without eventually facing the kind of political pressure and economic coercion that has characterized Beijing's relationships with other partners. The timing of the deal is significant in ways that go beyond the immediate circumstances. This is happening at a moment when the entire international order that emerged after World War II is being questioned and restructured. American global leadership, which seemed unchallengeable after the Soviet collapse, now faces a legitimate peer competitor in China and growing skepticism from allies who question whether American commitments are reliable across different administrations. The rules-based international system is under stress from multiple directions, and the Canada-China deal is both a symptom of that stress and a contributor to it. If Canada, the most integrated of America's allies, can make this kind of move, what does it signal to other nations about the durability of American-led alliances? What does it suggest about whether the future belongs to rigid alliance structures or fluid, interest-based partnerships that shift according to economic and strategic calculations? Behind closed doors, American strategists are conducting urgent reviews of all alliance relationships, asking which other partners might be vulnerable to Chinese inducements, and what the United States can offer to prevent similar defections. The problem they're discovering is that many of America's traditional tools of influence, from trade access to security guarantees, are less compelling than they used to be. China's economic scale and its willingness to make long-term commitments without the political conditions that often accompany Western aid and investment make it an attractive partner for countries that have grown weary of lectures about democracy and human rights. The United States still has enormous advantages in military power, technological innovation, and soft power, but translating those advantages into the kind of practical, immediate benefits that compete with a $7 billion infrastructure and trade package is proving challenging. The deal also exposes the internal contradictions in American policy that Canadian leaders have been pointing out for years. The United States wants allies to reduce their dependence on China and to join in containing Chinese influence, but American consumers continue to purchase Chinese products in massive quantities, and American companies continue to manufacture in China and invest in Chinese markets because the economic incentives are too powerful to resist. Asking Canada to forego Chinese investment while American businesses actively seek it comes across as hypocritical and undermines the moral authority that might otherwise make such requests compelling. The Canada-China deal forces Americans to confront the gap between their rhetoric about standing up to China and their behavior when it comes to their own economic choices. As news of the deal has spread and the initial shock has begun to wear off, a more nuanced conversation has started to emerge about what this really means and where things go from here. Some analysts argue that the $7 billion figure, while substantial, isn't actually large enough to fundamentally alter the Canada-US economic relationship, which measures in the trillions over the lifetime of the China deal. They suggest that this might be more about signaling and leverage than actual reorientation, Canada's way of getting American attention and forcing a renegotiation of terms that have become increasingly unfavorable from the Canadian perspective. Others contend that the specific dollar amount misses the point, that the real significance lies in the psychological and strategic shift, the demonstration that Canada can and will look beyond the United States when its interests demand it. The question of what happens next depends enormously on how the United States chooses to respond. The worst possible approach, according to most experts, would be punishment and retaliation. Threatening Canada with tariffs, restricting access to American markets, or attempting to economically coerce Canada into abandoning the China deal would only validate Canadian fears about American unreliability and push them further toward Beijing. It would confirm the narrative that the United States treats Canada not as an ally, but as a subordinate that must be disciplined when it steps out of line. The smarter approach, though politically more difficult, would be to recognize that this deal happened because of American failures in the relationship, and to use it as a wake-up call to rebuild the partnership on more equitable terms. That would mean genuine consultation on trade policy, recognition of Canadian interests and concerns, and concrete commitments that demonstrate that the United States values the relationship enough to make it a priority rather than taking it for granted. Whether American leaders can muster the humility and strategic vision to take that smarter approach remains to be seen. The political incentives point in the opposite direction, toward chest-thumping nationalism, and demands that Canada demonstrate its loyalty. But those incentives ignore the reality that the world has changed, that American power, while still formidable, is no longer unchallenged, and that allies have options they didn't have a generation ago. The Canada-China deal is a test of whether the United States can adapt to a more multipolar world where even close allies maintain diverse relationships and pursue their own interests, or whether American foreign policy remains locked in a mindset of dominance that no longer matches the distribution of global power. This moment will be remembered as either the beginning of a new, more complex, but potentially more resilient North American partnership, or as the point where a relationship that defined both nations for centuries began its slow unraveling. The infrastructure that China will build in Canada, the supply chains that will be established, the relationships that will develop, these create facts on the ground that will persist regardless of political changes in Ottawa, Washington, or Beijing. Once built, ports don't disappear. Once established, trade routes don't vanish. The physical and economic geography of North America is being redrawn, and the map that emerges over the next decade will determine security and prosperity patterns for generations to come. The story of Canada's $7 billion deal with China is ultimately a story about change, about the end of assumptions that seemed permanent, about the necessity of adaptation in a world that no longer respects the old hierarchies and relationships. It's a story about pride and pragmatism, about survival and sovereignty, about the price of loyalty and the cost of independence. It's a reminder that betrayal is a word we use when someone acts in their own interest instead of ours, and that from another perspective, the same action might look like long overdue self-assertion. History will judge whether this was Canada's biggest mistake or its smartest move, but right now, in this moment, what's clear is that nothing will be quite the same again. The phone lines between Ottawa and Washington are burning with urgent conversations trying to manage the immediate crisis and prevent further deterioration. Diplomats are scrambling to find language that acknowledges both nations' positions without conceding the fundamental points that neither side can afford to surrender. Business leaders are recalculating supply chains and market strategies. Intelligence officials are assessing vulnerabilities and updating threat models, and ordinary citizens on both sides of the border are trying to understand what this means for their jobs, their security, their future. The deal has been signed, the announcement has been made. The reaction has been fierce and divided. Now comes the hard part, living with the consequences and figuring out how to build a relationship that works in this new reality, rather than clinging to the comfortable certainties of a world that no longer exists. So now it's your turn to weigh in on something that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not. Did Canada just make the boldest move in its modern history or the biggest mistake? Is this betrayal, or is this what survival looks like in a world where loyalty is expensive and alternatives exist? Drop your honest opinion in the comments right now, because this conversation needs every perspective, every voice, every person willing to think beyond the headlines and the hot takes. If this video grabbed you, if it made you think, if it made you question assumptions you didn't even know you had, smash that like button, because that tells me you want more stories that dig into the hidden forces reshaping our world while everyone else is distracted by the surface noise. And subscribe, because what happened between Canada, the U.S., and China is just the beginning.